Welcome, VC Ag Today, Thursday morning, September 10th, 2020. Appreciate everyone joining us this morning. Hope everybody's doing well. Looks like we got a pretty good turnout. I see some folks still trickling in, so we're going to go ahead and get started. It is right at 9 o'clock. As folks come in, we'll go ahead and admit them. Pleased to be joined this morning again by Dr. Michael Flesner, Extension Weed Science Specialist. Topic of discussion this morning is going to be Palmer amaranth. Going to be discussing some identification and control of the weed. Now's a good time if you've been traveling around the state, at least in this area. Certainly you probably have seen it if you've been looking for it. So appreciate everyone joining us. Just one note that I'd like to make, as I always do. If you have questions or comments, please save those to the end of the presentation or put those in the chat window and we'll address those as we can at the end of the presentation. And appreciate everyone being here and looking forward to a great presentation this morning. So Dr. Flesner, thank you again for joining us as always.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be with you guys this morning and talk about most everybody's favorite weed, Palmer amaranth here. So we'll get right into it on starting with identification of it here. So we have really four main pigweed species that we deal with, or amaranth species we deal with in Virginia. Of course, smooth or red root that we've had for a while, we're pretty used to, although now we're probably pretty used to dealing with Palmer amaranth in parts of Virginia too. And then we also have spiny amaranth, which is more of a problem in our pastures, but does get in our crop fields every now and then. And then we have some water hemp, or common water hemp, kind of out there hanging around in patches, but that's one still pretty rare in the state. So it's important to be able to identify these, not only identify them this time of year, which is a great time to scout for them, because Palmer amaranth has some obvious features this time of year with its seed head, but ideally we can identify them when they're still very small and we can, control them and they're susceptible to herbicides at that time. So one of the big differentiating things is the stem hairiness. So smooth and red root, I don't know why they call it smooth when it has hairy stems, but it's just one of those things. But smooth and red root have hairy stems, and I'll show you a picture on the screen on the next slide here. But the rest of those three pigweeds, water hemp, Palmer amaranth, and spiny amaranth, all have smooth stems. And so that's kind of the first thing I look at are there hairs on the stems or not? Once you have identified that, you can look at the petiole or the leaf stalk length of Palmer amaranth. If it's got a very long petiole, then it's Palmer amaranth. And of course it has the absence of spines, which differentiates spiny amaranth. So here's a picture of the stem hairiness, if you could see the screen. If you're not, this is not like a Duck Dynasty beard hairiness on the stem. It's more like a peach fuzz on it. So it's kind of mealy gray appearance, and that's smooth red root. But if it's a smooth hairless stem, then it's one of the other pigweeds that could be Palmer amaranth. Here's some pictures of that petiole length with the leaf stalk. So if you can, if you take a mature leaf off of a pigweed plant, you don't want to get one that's still growing and still expanding because the ratios may not be quite right yet. But if you go down on the plant to get a mature one, and you can pluck that leaf right off of the stem and then fold that leaf stalk over on the leaf. If it's as long, or certainly in many cases longer than the leaf itself, then that's pretty diagnostic for Palmer amaranth. If it's shorter than the length itself, than the length of the leaf, then it's probably smooth or red root or one of the other pigweeds. So early in the season, before you have that seed head, that's pretty key on Palmer amaranth. Those are the two features that can really get you pretty quickly to Palmer amaranth or not Palmer amaranth. But this time of year, we have that long terminal seed head that you can see poking up through soybean fields as you're driving around. It just kind of looks like it's giving you the middle finger there. It can be well over a foot tall, whereas the other pigweeds is generally a little bit shorter than that. And so that's also very diagnostic of Palmer amaranth. So those are the three key features: that long petiole, hairless stem, and then that long seed head to get you to Palmer amaranth. So we have it, as Robbie mentioned, it's definitely around. It's pretty much everywhere we grow soybeans in Virginia. So those are the maroon counties there, and then the orange ones filled in on the map are a couple in the Shenandoah Valley that we've seen Palmer move in there in the last year or two. So it's not in every field, but it's certainly around, and it's also got a map there on the screen, courtesy of Ben Beal in Maryland, of where it is in Maryland and Delaware, where they've spotted it. So it's definitely around us, and can be moving with equipment, with animals, with those kinds of things, with water as well. So it's around. I do think we need to spend a minute on the biology of this weed, because we got to appreciate it for what it is. I think our biggest mistake managing this is we tend to underestimate how weedy this weed really is, for lack of a better term. I mean, this it started with developed the glyphosate resistance probably in a couple different instances, but first recognized in southern Georgia in 2005. And so it probably started a couple of years before that, before they were able to recognize it and diagnose it as glyphosate resistance. But that has really opened it, created a niche for it to spread throughout our corn, soybean cropping systems, all the way up to North Dakota and into New York and out west. And so, I think some people think, well, I'm a better farmer than these other farmers, but this is one that it doesn't matter how good a farmer you are. It can definitely, if you turn your back on it for a minute, can really start making headway and getting into your operation. So it's the biology of it. It's native to the desert, and so you think about a desert plant, it's going to naturally be heat and drought tolerant. But then also, when we get rain, it's going to grow real fast and has a really rapid growth rate under optimal conditions. It has this really prolonged germination period. Again, when you think of it trying to take advantage of rainfall from the desert, whenever it rains, it's going to want to come up. And that's really what it does in our systems in Virginia. So we might see it as early as March coming up, but it really starts hitting the ground running in mid to late May. And then it can germinate all season long, really till we get a killing frost. But it starts to tail off this time of year in September. But we can get, germination, and I think we can still get some viable seed production really after we harvest our corn. Is something to think about. If it's out there all year, it's going to produce tons of seed, and it's got a real extensive root system that can really suck out a lot of water out of the ground. Let's see what else about it. So some of the things to think about for management is the seed are relatively short-lived in the soil. Really, after 3 to 4 years of good control with very little or ideally no seed return, we're going to deplete that soil seed bank to pretty much nothing at that point. So that's, I think, the good news is you can come back from a real disaster with, relatively short time horizon of good management. It's not as competitive in shade, and partly because it's coming up from that very small seed. There's not a lot of energy stored in there. So getting a good crop canopy as fast as we can is important. But it does seem to be able to, once it's there, it can kind of hang out underneath that crop canopy and eventually poke its way up through. But it's not going to be this huge seed producer when it's being coming up from underneath that crop canopy. Big thing for us is it's herbicide resistant. So we pretty much, I would assume, if you have Palmer in Virginia, you have glyphosate and ALS or Group 2 resistant Palmer amaranth. In other parts of the world and the U.S., it's much worse. One notable case would be in North Carolina, where they have PPO or Group 14 resistance in addition to that. And when you try to think about what your herbicide program is going to look like in a glyphosate Group 2 and Group 14 resistant population in soybeans, it gets pretty limited there. Okay, so what are the management keys? I've got 6 keys here, and we'll go through them one by one. And these aren't really anything groundbreaking. This is really just kind of basic weed management, but with a weed as aggressive and competitive and hard to control as this one, all of these things become really critically important. So the first thing we got to do is start clean. If we've got some little cotyledon, seedling weeds out there at planting, we're already behind on this weed, and it's just not a position that we can win from on this weed. So we've got to start clean. Generally for our corn crop, that's pretty easy to do because we're ahead of pretty much all the germination when we're putting that crop in the ground. But certainly soybean and double crop soybeans, that's where it becomes important. So that's point number one. Point number two is to use residual herbicides at planting. We've got to take advantage of these pre-emergent herbicides. It's really the foundation of controlling this weed, and I'll show you why in a couple slides. But I think we also got to think about when we put out those pre's. So, you know, a lot of times we want to save a trip across the field. I get that. So you add that pre in with your burn down. You might do that 2-3 weeks ahead of when you're actually planting, going to plant the crop. But if we can move that pre-emergence application to at planting, you know, that residual activity of the herbicide, it's going to wear off over time. And by applying it closer to planting, we're going to take advantage of that activity further into the crop and help protect the crop more that way. So that's another thing to think about. The other thing I think we really have to do with a weed that comes up all year long, and I think this year where we, at least in a lot of parts of Virginia, we kind of had that drought kind of right after we were harvesting wheat, and a lot of the crops just didn't grow for 2 or 3 weeks, right? And so we didn't get that canopy closure as much. So with Palmer amaranth, you know, trying to come up during that time and we're not getting that canopy or delaying that canopy closure, having another residual herbicide applied along with that over the top post is going to help protect that crop even further. And that was really critical this year in Virginia. All right, so what does the pre-emergent herbicides do for us? This is a pretty complicated graph I have on the screen, but I'll try to explain it here. This is just the density of Palmer amaranth through time from various herbicide treatments. And then, so as you go from a non-treated control, which has a lot of Palmer amaranth, to the right of the slide, which moves into the herbicides that work better on it, you know, we really reduce that density kind of 17 to 31 days after treatment. So if you think about putting out your pre-emergent herbicide at planting, this would be, you know, 3 to 4 weeks into the crop, which is typically when you'd come back with your post-emergent herbicide. So you see that there's a lot fewer Palmer amaranth plants to have to kill post-emergence when we use that pre-emergent herbicide. The other couple things I would point out here is that really the herbicides that perform best included either flumioxazin or sulfentrazone. So flumioxazin is going to be in Valor, Valor XLT, Invive, and several other products. Sulfentrazone is going to be basically your Authority brands and Broadax. So those are Authority will have sulfentrazone and something else in it. So those to me are really kind of the foundation herbicides we need, one or the other of those for Palmer amaranth. The other thing that you can see here is that as we move from one site of action or one group number herbicide to a herbicide that either through tank mixing or a prepackaged mixture has multiple sites of action, those generally perform better. So as an example, going from Valor to Fierce, which would be going from flumioxazin to flumioxazin plus pyroxasulfone residua, you know, we reduced by over 50% the number of plants out there in that field. So we're getting better control with those multiple sites of action products, and it's also good for herbicide resistance because that's really what's it's much more difficult to develop herbicide resistance that way. Another thing though, so we reduce the density by using a pre. The other thing we do reduce is really the ones that do escape that pre, and they will eventually, and we really only get 3 to 5 weeks out of our best performing pre-emergence options. So some are eventually going to escape, but the ones that do escape don't grow as fast. And so what's on the screen now, if you're following along on the screen, is the height of Palmer amaranth at a couple times after treatment, 24 and 31 days after treatment. And so we want to target Palmer amaranth when it's 4 inches or less, and you can see those kind of same herbicides that worked best for reducing density also worked best for reducing the growth rate of Palmer amaranth. And so that gives us more time to get in these fields and make a timely post-emergence application there. So I think that's something that maybe we don't think about all the time with the residual herbicide, but something that's really critical for managing this weed. All right, so to me, this is a picture, if you can't see the screen, of a fairly recent bowl game here. And this is one that I turned off at halftime, and maybe many of you did because Virginia Tech was down 24 points at halftime here. They ended up coming back in the Belk Bowl here in 2016 to beat Arkansas 35-24. And I think a lot of us were shocked they had turned off the television. And so this was the best comeback in Virginia Tech football history. So 127 years of football, they were able to make this come from behind victory, right? This is not really the position you want to be in with Palmer Amaranth. It's trying to overcome a deficit, right? Maybe in 127 years you can overcome it and do it, but really we need to use a pre-emergent herbicide to put ourselves in a position to win that game. Okay. The other thing I talked about was understanding what is in those pre-mixed products, and the ones that have multiple active ingredients or group numbers perform better. But as we're moving into winter, hopefully eventually after harvest, we'll have some time to think about our herbicide program, a little more detail. One thing to think about is what is in these mixes and what are they doing for me. So this is Valor XLT, and I'm not picking on Valor XLT. I could use a number of herbicides for this example, but when you look at Valor XLT, the picture of that plot has no weeds in it, which is what we want. The herbicide is working. Well, there's two active ingredients in that herbicide, Valor and Classic, or flumioxazin and chlorimiron. And so when you look at those two individually, you see the Valor plot has no weeds in it, which again, so we know that the flumioxazin part is working. But when we look at the Classic plot, it has weeds in it, right? So on a group 2 resistant population, the Classic is not really bringing that effective side of action to the table. So while Classic might be helping us, and it probably is with a lot of other weeds in that field, for Palmer Amaranth, it may not be bringing as much to the table, and that's something to think about with these. So so take some time this winter to understand what is in those pre-mixes. The other thing I mentioned earlier is including a residual in with that post-emergence application. Here's a couple of our pots here at Blackstone at the Southern Piedmont AREC this year. And the one on the left had a residual with the post-emergence application. The one on the right did not. And you can see that there's Palmer coming up in between those rows there. Now, just sort of another aside here, this is on 30-inch rows. Which is good for testing a herbicide, but for production, I don't know that I'd recommend those because it takes a while to canopy, right? If we can get to 15 inches or less, we're going to get canopy a lot quicker, and that's really going to help out the herbicides in this case. But nonetheless here, that really the difference between these two is really that using that residual in with the post-emergent herbicide, and that's what was key to keeping it clean in this set of plots. All right, so that was a lot about number 2, which was using point number 2 of management, using a residual herbicide. Number 3 is just that timing of application. We have got to get small weeds treated, not large weeds. When you see a small Palmer Amaranth, like what's on the right on the screen, you see all those leaves are able to intercept the herbicide, and we're going to get pretty good control of that weed, versus the one on the right that's going on 6 inches tall. You see there's kind of layers of leaves in that canopy, so the herbicide's only really going to hit that top layer. The other thing is when you're thinking about putting on a dosage here, an effective dose on a 3-inch weed is going to be a half rate on a 6-inch weed. Hopefully that makes sense. But as the weed gets bigger, we're not increasing our dosage. And so cutting, one way of thinking about treating too large of weeds is basically like cutting the rate on a small weed. And that's not good for control. It's not good for herbicide resistance. So that's point number 3 is timely with our applications. Number 4 is do not ignore escapes. And so we've got to think about these fields where we just have 1 or 2 plants. It's not too bad to go out there and hand pull those plants. Or, at harvest, one thing we could do, this might be blasphemy to some people out there, is to stop the combine, get out, grab that weed, and then keep going with the combine if it's just 1 or 2 plants out there. Don't run it through the combine where you're going to spread it into that patch in year 2. And we can easily have a disaster by year 3, certainly by year 4, if we're not recognizing that weed, that new weed in the field and changing our management from it. And that's been seen time and time again all over the eastern U.S. So it can go to a wall-to-wall disaster, completely unproductive field in a very short time if we don't jump on it. So, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that's something we've got to remember here. Another thing about prevention is I mentioned with harvest, and we've got these combines that they're great at getting crops out of the field, but they're also great at spreading weed seeds. And we've got these residue packages on them that really can do a pretty good job about spreading that and chopping up all that residue, but they also can help spread those weed seeds from one plant to, you know, a whole swath and patch in the field. And so thinking about now when we're out there starting to harvest is what can we do at harvest time? And we'll have a couple slides about that later, but it's something to think about. Crop rotation, I think, is also something we've got to do. It's really, palm amaranth to me is a big problem in soybeans in the state. We should have the herbicide tools to control it well in corn, but if you're not, you know, we should talk about what you're doing and be on the lookout for other cases of herbicide resistance too. But we've got some options in corn and atrazine and the bleachers, the group 27s that really do a good job. But if we're in continuous soybean, then it's going to be an uphill battle there. But the more diverse we can make our rotation, really the better. So I know wheat acres, I guess, we're down and they might be back up, but you know, if we can get a 3-crop 2-year rotation in there with wheat, that I think that's really the most diverse system that really capitalizes on our markets in Virginia, but also has really good things for Palmer amaranth management in terms of herbicides, but also when we're putting out herbicides and changing that up from one year to the next. So crop rotation is key to this, just like it is for a lot of other important agronomic reasons. So yeah, so those are the management keys I wanted to go over, but there are a couple kind of things right now that we can do when we're thinking about harvest here. So one of those is, I know a lot of you are going to harvest the field in kind of the way that makes sense. But if we can harvest the weed-free areas first and move within that field to the weedy areas, we're not going to be spreading the weed from a weedy patch into a weed-free area, right? We're going to kind of keep it where it is, and that'll help stop its spread. The other thing is between fields, if we can clean the combine before leaving. So, you know, a leaf blower to blow off all the just kind of the crud that's on the back axle and that kind of stuff can really help out. If you can get a couple bales of straw or hay and just run those through there through the combine, that'll help kind of knock out some of the weed seeds that are in there. You're probably not going to get them all, but you know, it's something quick, relatively quick and easy to do to try to get more seeds out of there. The other thing you can do is just try to crank up that fan speed all the way and run it for a minute or two to try to blow out those little seeds and then kind of go back to where it needs to be before harvest. So clean the combine between weed fields. You know, nobody wants to talk about slowing down during harvest, but you know, maybe we could at least take advantage of some rainy days or do some pretty easy things there before we leave the field would be definitely advisable here. When we talk about mowing corn stalks down, you know, the bush hog is something that is probably the easiest thing to clean on the farm or close to it. But you know, sometimes we we don't want to get out of that tractor and kick that residue off or blow it off with a leaf blower, and that can be a lot of weed seeds, you know, moving from one field to the next or within the field. So cleaning that bush hog off is certainly a something I think it's pretty easy to do and can go a long way to help prevent the spread of that. Another thing we can think about this time of year is planting a cover crop. We've seen a lot of research that these small seeded summer annuals like Palmer and then the other pigweeds, these cover crops are really helping us, especially when we grow a big, good cover crop. They're really helping us in our weed management because they've got to come up through that shaded or filtered or sometimes really greatly reduced light. There's also this barrier, and on a small seeded weed that makes a whole lot of sense. And so I know some people are nervous about planting through this, but this is Taylor Clark, an agent and farmer in Southside Virginia, on it with a 15-inch planter there, and he's been doing this a while and getting a good stand. Some of you probably know Rob Hinton on the Northern Neck. This is a picture of his farm planting green into some cereal rye and some pretty pretty high biomass stuff there. So. There's farmers that if you put your mind to it, you can talk to and figure out what planter adjustments need to be made or not made in some cases to plant through this. But that residue can really help us out, and it's just, you know, something to think about this time of year that we can do if we've had Palmer amaranth on our field. And it does help us. I'm going to kind of just jump through that for the sake of time. The other thing that, you know, we don't want to talk about, but if we do get in this disaster situation, is breaking out a moldboard plow. And, you know, we have all these benefits of no-till. There's some research out of Nebraska that shows a one-time tillage event doesn't do as much negative damage as we think it does, but their soils are a lot different than ours. So I don't want to, anyway, I just kind of want to throw this out here for food for thought. The moldboard plow can really, if we bury those seed, Palmer amaranth can't come up from depth. It's really 1 or 2 inches in depth, and it's not going to come up. So if we can bury as many of those seeds as we can, we're not going to get them all, but we'll really reduce that stand for next year. And if we don't plow it again for 3 or 4 years, which I think most of us would like to do, right, to not plow, those seeds will eventually perish down there. And so that's one tactic that they've used here, in the pictures on the screen are from Georgia, but that they've used there to try to get a handle on things. And so I hope we don't have to revert to this, but that's something that's out there, and a tactic that we may not want to rule out in certain cases. So with that, I'm just going to throw up some links in the chat to the pest management guide for field crops that has some of these tables in it, like you see here. We've got a column for Palmer amaranth and water hemp. This is the pre-emergence herbicides in corn table, but we've got a post-emergence in corn. Same thing for the other crops as well. So that's a really good list of information of where you can find what's going to do well on that weed. And we also have a fairly recently updated last year Palmer amaranth control and soybean publication that kind of goes through everything I've talked about today, and has some of those efficacy tables in it in terms of what herbicides work well for this weed. The other one we're working on, I don't know if we have any cotton growers on the line with us this morning, but we'll have one out here before the winter meetings get going for Palmer amaranth control in cotton. So hopefully I didn't go too long there. It might have been like a fire hose of information, but it's kind of my stump speech here, so wanted to get it all out there. But I guess if we have time for questions, we'll open it for questions now.
All right, thank you, Dr. Flesner. Appreciate you joining us as always. We'll jump right into questions. I was just checking the chat box. Just had one pop up. Mike, do you want to go ahead and ask your question to Dr. Flesner?
So the question is Liberty in combination with Liberty Link crops still a good viable option for Palmer? I think absolutely Liberty is a great option for Palmer. You know, we don't know if we'll have the Extend system next year or not, and the Enlist system with 2,4-D, we may not have the best maturity group still for some parts of our state, but the Enlist system does have the option of Liberty use in that system. But I think Liberty is great, but we got to recognize that Liberty is not Roundup. Liberty, it's a contact herbicide, so it really comes down to, again, spraying small weeds and getting good coverage of those weeds. Whereas, you know, Roundup, when it was working, we could really kind of run across the field with very little spray water and knock out bigger weeds because it was just so potent. But fortunately, we just don't have a herbicide that works like that anymore. So I think Liberty Link is a great option, and it avoids, you know, we can always get off target movement of a herbicide or any pesticide, but it really is a much, you know, easier and less liability concerns when it comes to off target movement. So I think it's a great option that's out there. You know, I don't know that it's really any better than like a Flexstar Reflex or Cobra Ultra Laser, but it's definitely one that's out there, and I think it's a one that we really need to take more advantage of in the state. Luke asked what options are available to vegetable growers. So I'm not the vegetable specialist, but certainly you're much more limited in your herbicides there. If it's a vegetable that you can use something like Dual in or S-metolachlor, that's going to go a long way for you. But if you're looking at like or metribuzin in tomatoes would be a good option pre-emergence for you. But we're really limited on selective options, especially because of the ALS resistance. So something like Sandia is going to be ineffective for us against Palmer. So yeah, it's trying to keep that seed bank low and hand pulling or roguing out the weeds or keeping that seed rain from going back to the soil is going to be even more critical. The more limited our options are, the more critical just keeping a low seed bank, I think, really is for management of these weeds.
Michael, one question that I get pretty commonly this time of year, you talked about going out and scouting fields, looking for road plants and stuff. At what point, I've had this conversation with some folks, at what point do you tend to see those seeds becoming viable? Because if you go out, when you first start to see the seed head emergence, those seeds are developing, they're still green. I know it changes from year to year as to, a definite date by which they would be mature, but what do you typically recommend to folks? I mean, obviously, if they see it and have the ability to remove it, but at what point does those seeds really actually become viable for next season?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think you're right that it definitely is going to vary by year, but it's generally within 2 weeks of the first flower that you see, you'll have either viable seeds or seeds that are mature enough that they'll dry down and become viable even if you remove those from the plant. And so we're definitely well into where this time of year when we have viable seeds on the plant. So I think it's still worthwhile to remove those because we're still going to get more seed production for the next month or so on a lot of those Palmer amaranth plants. So, but I've seen, it's funny what the plant will do under stress. Again, I think part of that's back to its desert nature is that if it does get stress, what it wants to do is keep that life cycle going. And so I've seen it flower and put on a seed head. I didn't see any viable seeds on it, but I've seen that in May because we kind of it came up and then it got cold again, and the plant just kind of thought it needed to go to seed, prolong the species there. So you can get those kinds of things that happen, but I think mostly in our crop situations, certainly like July, we need to be on the lookout for it. Certainly in August, we're going to have some viable seed on the plant, and it's just going to kind of grow into September. But so if you've got some plants out there and you want to try to eliminate seed production, yeah, if you see a flower, like I said, you've got, maybe 1 week to do something about it, or it's going to start putting on viable seed.
And a follow up to that, Michael, I always recommend to folks, don't just pull it up and throw it right on the ground in the field. Take it out of the field somewhere and remove it because those seeds may have the potential to be viable.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And if you're pulling before you have a flower or seed on the plant, it's a good idea to at least try to stand it upright where the roots are up in the air and not near the ground, because it can reroot and stand back up and keep growing. And I've learned that one the hard way. It's not fun hand pulling a field once, and certainly it's not fun the second time. So make sure, you get those plants out of the field.
Any other questions or comments this morning for Michael? You should have the ability to unmute yourself on the other end. So if you have a question, please do so.
Hey, Robbie, I got one last question.
Yes, sir, Mike.
Dr. Fleston, when you pull this, of course, Palmer's an annual. You break off a major root, say one you can see when you pull it up, you're missing a root, a good sized root. Will it come back from that one root?
Yeah.
How intense do you have to be about getting the roots out?
So I haven't seen it come back from a root, but I don't really know. I don't think it can, but that's I'm not 100% positive on that. I know if you come out there like with a machete and hack it off at the ground, it can basically stump sprout almost like a tree. So you definitely want to pull up and get, at least the roots that'll come up with the stem there. But I don't think it'll come back from, if you left a good chunk of root in there. It's at least I haven't seen it.
I didn't think so. I pulled one time and one of the main roots did break off, but I kept eye on it. It was a place I could keep an eye on, and it never did come back.
Okay.
But I was just curious.
Good.
All right, any other questions, comments? I know it's, as Dr. Flesner said, I know it's quite a bit of Palmer scattered around, especially in the eastern part of Virginia. So now's a really good time if you have some opportunity to get out and take a look at that. Well, I'm not hearing anything, so I guess that.
Dr. Flesner,
Yes, sir, Taylor.
what are the odds that we'll have, do you think that you end up having XtendFlex seed available this year, but not the Extend product?
Trying to predict, I guess, what, well, the EPA for the Extend product and what the European Union is going to decide, and when they're both going to do that for the seed on this. That's a tough question, and I know a lot of people are anxious to know the answer to that, because it's about time to start thinking about what kind of varieties and seed we want to buy for next year. Yeah, I know that Bayer thinks that they're going to have the seed in place for next year, or is at least extremely optimistic about it. The EPA and election year on the product side of things is really tough to predict. Certainly, there's a lot of, I guess there's a lot of interest on both sides to have it re-registered or to not have it re-registered. But yeah, that's a tough question. I wish we had more maturity groups to really cover the state with on the Enlist side, because I think that's really the system we know is going to be in place, and can give us just as good a control with the 2,4-D as the dicamba does. So, but yeah, it'd be nice to know. I guess I don't really have anything intelligent to say about that, Taylor. I'm sorry, but we need. We're going to have to make decisions pretty quick.
And then is it any possible way that Liberty or E3 beans has the production to meet the demand for this coming year, from a seed standpoint?
Yeah, I'm not a seedsman, and I should be, I guess, more in tune with that side of things. But from my understanding is that they're going to try to meet the demands for those maturity groups that they have. But like I said, I know I've talked to some people that, they want, once you get into the 5s or on up from there, you really start running out of options with the Enlist E3 system. So I got I think a few early 4s and mid 4s, but we start running out, as we get further in the state where we want to plant those group 5s and such. But I don't know if maybe anyone in the call can comment more intelligently than me on that. But that's what I'm hearing from my side of things.
Yeah.
Dr. Flesner, the products that you have talked about, Valor and et cetera, do they have any? Do they work also on, say, these mare's tail and ragweed? Do they have some sort of effect on those as well? Because I'm seeing all of those in the field, plus some of the pigweeds are escaping, and some palmer.
Sure, it's a good question. I think, yeah, definitely like mare's tail and common ragweed are number 2 and 3 weeds. If not, maybe ragweed might be number 1 ahead of palmer as far as problems in soybeans in the state of Virginia. So in general, like the Valor and sulfentrazone products are going to be as good as you can do on the ragweed, but they're not going to be as good as they are on Palmer. So, you know, where I'm thinking we'll expect to see, you know, 90% or better from those products on Palmer, I'm thinking 75, 80% on ragweed, just because it's a larger seed and it's got more energy, a little more punch to get through some of those products. But those are basically among the best you can apply for ragweed. For the mare's tail, I haven't seen a whole lot of germination once we get into the soybean crop. So to me, really the key, I think a lot of the residual herbicides that we're going to use are going to work pretty well on mare's tail. So I don't know if there's really one to specifically call it and recommend, but I would say our problems with mare's tail are usually when we think we kill it in the burn down, but we don't, and it comes back. So we'll, you know, something will paraquat or sharpen on too large of a mare's tail, you know, we'll kill all those leaves and brown it up and then plant the soybeans. And then, you know, a week after that, we start seeing all those sprouts coming out of the stem that wasn't quite dead. And so to me, really mare's tail is more about killing it before we plant our soybean crop than it is, you know, residual control in there.
And so you're saying paraquat is probably the best. I mean, we're trying to move towards planting green as well, and so, you know, we're maybe running into an issue there with putting something else in to assist with it. But paraquat maybe is the best option for a burn down.
Well, not necessarily. That's just an example of one, you know, with contact activity that we think it's dead, and then maybe it's not if we get on bigger weeds. But I mean, to me, in the burn down, a glyphosate and 2,4-D is really tough to beat for the money. Paraquat and Sharpen and 2,4-D and pretty much all the options work really well on the rosette stage mare's tail or horseweed, but once it starts to bolt, you know, they all kind of start dying. All the herbicide options kind of get reduced in their ability to kill that weed. But if you do have some that are tall, that's really when we need to move to like away from a contact herbicide like Paraquat and Sharpen and even Liberty, move away from those and to a 2,4-D or dicamba product, because those are going to do a little bit better on the larger mare's tail, but everything has its limits.
All right. Any other questions or comments for Dr. Flusner this morning? Well, not hearing any, Michael. We appreciate you joining us as always. Thank you again for your time. Great presentation. If anybody would like a copy of the presentation or the recording, you see the link there posted on the screen for the recordings. You can find this week's version as well as all of our past versions of VC Ag Today at that link. So please share that with folks that you think may benefit from that. Help spread the word. With that being said, we appreciate everyone joining us this morning. Again, thank you, Dr. Flusner. Also would like to take a few seconds to thank the production team, my colleagues that helped make this effort possible. Mike Broadus, Stephanie Romochek, Trent Jones, and Laura Maxine. Thank you to you all for all of your assistance and help as well. Please join us next week, same time, same place. We hope to have another presentation on financials, farm financials, crediting, those topics. So please join us next week for that. And thank you again for everyone joining us. If you just take a few moments, Stephanie has entered into the chat window the evaluation link. If you just click on that, it'll take you directly to a very short evaluation, take less than a minute for you to complete and give us some feedback, how the program is. If there's other topics you'd like to see covered of interest, please take a few moments to do that for us. So thank you again for joining us. Hope everyone has a great rest of your week and stay safe. And thank you again, Michael, for your time this morning. Appreciate you joining us.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you again, everyone. Stay safe and have a great rest of Thursday.